Okay, the fourth of the group constraints I want to talk about is process constraints. And this is one I think is the kicker. This is the most important one of all of them. If you don't pay attention to any of them, pay attention to this. And process is really just about how do we direct members' behaviors. So people are going to be doing things, and so how do we direct what they're doing in a certain direction, and how do we get them to do the things that we know are going to lead to a good outcome? Right? So what are the steps that we do in a row? So again, how do I get a meaningful sequence of tasks? What are the things that they do, in what order? How do I make sure that the group shares the same goal? That when they do these things, that they're trying to do them in the same direction, so that way when the instructions don't work or aren't completely accurate or aren't perfect, they still are moving in the right direction. How do I keep the group focused on the task? And for some tasks that are hard tasks, the group will tend to wander away, and so we really need to keep them focused on the task. And then also, in the end, how do we keep them working in ways that we know are effective ways to work? And that's the problem of process. That's the problem that we want to talk about for teams. If you think about innovation as a process, it could be pretty straightforward. We do this thing called idea generation. We have lots of ideas and look for all different kinds of possibilities, duct tape and antimatter and all these things. We then have to assess, because we can't do all the different things, we have to do a smaller amount of them. So we do this thing called assessment, so we bring that down. We then do concept selection. Choose the best one of those ideas. We have to refine it. It never works the first time, and so you always have to refine it. And then you go to this thing called concept implementation, where you put your head down and you just get that thing done. And so it seems pretty straightforward to just generate ideas, assess ideas, do concept selection, and then do refinement, and then do concept implementation. What's hard about that? Shouldn't be anything hard. Well, there are a couple of hard things, actually. One thing is understanding, which phase are you in? So there's all these different phases, these different things you could be doing. Which phase are you in? Do you have the skills for that phase? Where are we? Are we in phase 0? Are we in phase 1? Do we have different names for the phases, or are we brainstorming? And which part of brainstorming are we in? That sometimes people don't understand that. Also, the skills that you might have. Do you have the right skills that you need for that particular stage of the process? And so if it's a stage of deep analysis, do you have the analytics tools? If it's the stage of deep idea generation, do you have the idea generation skills and tools? And then also, once you're doing one phase, how do you know to move forward? Like, what do you do to say, okay, now it's time, we're done with that phase, and now we move forward? So it's not just quite as easy as it looks. So you still have to think about, what are the goals for a phase? So what are we trying to do now in this part? And when we're done, what have we gotten done? And also, what behaviors are required? And so if I have to do something now, what are the behaviors required for this phase? And how do I understand what those are? Do I have information inside my organization that tells me, or do I have to guess? Do I get to talk to people about it? Like, how is it that I know what needs to be done? So this innovation thing is actually as much a social process, I believe, as it is sort of this technical information process. So we do this thing called idea generation, which is in fact a divergent activity. Like, if you say up, I say down, because we're trying to explore a space and we want as many different kinds of ideas as possible. And so this social process of you say up, I say down, you say left, I say right, like we're trying to explore this space. Then at some point we have to say we've done enough exploration, it's time to converge. And we call this assessment. And so convergence is when we start agreeing with each other. So remember, a moment ago we were diverging, we were thinking differently from each other, now we have to think similar to each other. We then have to set direction, we have to commit, we have to sort of say this is what we're going to do together. That's hard, right? Get people to commit. Then we have to say diverge, because it never works the first time and you have to do some refinement on it and do some iteration. And so that may be hard for some people because they thought they had a great idea, or you didn't do their idea in the very early session, and so they're thinking like, wow, if we had just done my idea, we would be able to work now. We do another convergence, another alignment layer, and then we have to do the thing I call sushi and Red Bull. And that's where you lock people in a room and you say, work, you're not coming out until it's done. You sort of force people in there, and there's just implementation. No vacation, can't do anything, they have to stay in there until the project's done. And so through all these different phases, through all these different behaviors, how do people know what to do? We often don't tell them. So the problem is, people in groups are hard, groups are difficult. Groups don't use a process. If they use a process, they don't trust it. They say, oh, this is the HR people dreamed this one up, like what a dumb process this is. They rely on norms and assumptions. Oh, everyone knows what a brainstorm is, let's just go brainstorm. They miss learning curves, that maybe there's some time of which we can actually speed the group up by spending a lot of time together early on. But if we meet once intensely and then we don't meet for 3 months, then we meet again, we lose the learning curve. Also, groups may choose the wrong people. to be a part of a project. And that can be a big problem as well. More process issues. Groups try to jump ahead in the process. They say, well, I know we're brainstorming, exploring, diverging, but let's just get it done. Let's just implement. Right? So they want to skip all the stuff in between. Groups don't know, have we done enough exploration? Have we done enough assessment? How do we know? Groups don't know how to switch modes. How do I bring a group from this divergent activity to this convergent activity with everyone happy about making the change? You know, there's different goals at different times. What are the goals? How do I communicate the goals? And different behaviors at different times. How do I communicate people? That behavior was good yesterday, but it's not good today. Right? Because yesterday we were assessing ideas, and today we're trying to generate more new ideas, and that behavior didn't work. And so how do we do those things? That's going to be the difficult part about having groups and making groups work. And then what about the members? Remember I said something about who are the people, how we compose teams? What we tend to do is to say, okay, well, we're going to solve this problem. Let's get someone from marketing and someone from sales and someone from manufacturing and someone from here and someone from there and put them together in a team and make it work. Well, it sort of makes sense, but if you think about it this way, actually think about the knowledge domains that have to be there. Do you see any knowledge domains in this behavior that people have to do? They need to converge, diverge, they need to generate ideas. There's nothing in there about salesy or being marketing or being those things. And so some of this behavior, we may choose people to be in a team without really paying attention to what it is that they're going to be doing together. And so maybe we want to select on the behaviors more than on the knowledge that they have. Let me show you a little innovation style survey here. This was done by Kirton in 1994. Kirton suggested there are R innovators and A innovators, and they had these properties. R's were less disciplined, A's were tended to prefer precision. We had whether they manipulate or resolve the problem. We had things about working in short bursts or working steadily on a project. We have things of taking control versus being authority, wanting to do one or the other in groups. Challenging rules or working within the rules, or seeking radical change or seeking implementation. So if you looked at these two columns and said, okay, which one of these describes me a little bit better? And so think of the one that describes you. Are you type R, or are you a little bit more of a type A? And so just hang on to that idea of which one you are, and we'll get back to it in a second. So some people in groups tend to focus, and you may have been in a group where there's people who just, all they do is talk about antimatter, and they're just like radical ideas, and that's all they are. They're just spewing ideas all the time. They just can't stop themselves. So maybe you know some people like that. Maybe you are one of those people. Taking an innovation class, you may well be. There are other people in groups who tend to focus on implementation. It's like, okay, let's just do this, and let's make it small. Let's just get it done, that we can, and that's a very different kind of person. And we probably know people like that. Maybe you're a person like that as well. Focus on implementation. And then there's some people who are just focused on process. Oh my God, we're going to end. We're doomed. Everything is going to, because they really don't, all they care about is the process and getting stuff done and really not sort of thinking beyond that. I'm sure you're not that way. But sometimes the fact that we need to get stuff done can make us nervous, can make us focus on the process. So if we think about these process constraints, lack of process, right? So I should have showed you some things like these things here. When we get over focus on implementation, when we get these people in a room and they just can't communicate because they are being radical, and someone's saying, hey, we need antimatter, we're going to do it this way. Another person saying, no, let's use duct tape. Another person saying, no, let's hurry up. That's a problem. All those behaviors are useful in a group, but not at the same time, certainly not in the same room at the same phase. So the things we talked about lack of process, not having one. We talked about poor phase transitions, moving, not understanding why to move, and then also people just generally not trusting a process, that is, not understanding why they're doing it and believing in that it's a good thing to be doing what they're being asked to do. So how do we overcome these process constraints? It would be an important thing. Ideally, we'd be able to overcome these process constraints. Well, let's talk about a few things. So one thing to think about is to develop, master, and use a process. To have a process that's simple, good, but enforce its use. That is, make sure that you use the process. Because if you use a process and use it once and you have a good outcome, then you can do the same process again. And if you don't like the outcome, then you can say, well, maybe change this part of it. If everything is random every time, just like some people cook that way, it's one day it's great and one day it's not great, and you just can't make it happen again and again and again. And what we're after here is routine innovation. We want to be able to innovate on a routine basis and lock in the things that we know work. So simple is good. From my book, in chapter 3, for those of you who have the book, you can see in this diagram here to sort of talk about these 7 process steps and these different ways that you could step through the steps. And I have some good information, some detailed information about how it is, what are the specific things you can do to keep people on there. And so in the very early phase of getting everyone on the same page, phase 0, sort of framing the problem, very, very important, because if people don't start from the same place, they weren't certainly not going to end up at the same place. And on as we go through. What are the things we can do to help that process go through? So defining the problem, generating ideas, how do people do that? We talked about several steps so far of how to help people generate ideas. Assessing constraints, that's what we're doing in the class, and so each week I'm asking you to do some constraints assessment and sort of understand, if I do it this way, what's going to be the constraint? If I do it that way, what's going to be if I do it this way, it's going to cost money. If I do it this way, it's going to cost time. If I do it this way, it's going to cost people. And so I want to be thinking through those constraints. I need to set the direction, get the group to agree that in fact this is how we're going to do it together, do my design, do my refinement, and do my implementation. And in this simple language, at least if I say, hey, we're in phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3, we should know what we are. We're in phase 0 or we're in phase 1, and so that's how we could actually make that work. So to overcome process constraints, there's one thing that happens I think is very interesting where we don't manage the early stage of the process. And I'm going to call this the latte phase. So let me just give you a little example and show you what I mean here. So if you think about this in this way, that over the life of a project, you start out spending very little money, and then you end up at a place where you spend a lot of money, right? So in the research phase, you're just thinking things through. Maybe you have a few meetings. You're just doing just a small number of people. You haven't made any big decisions. You haven't purchased any inventory or anything. But by the end of the project, you have. You've purchased inventory. You've trained people. Maybe you bought raw material supplies and all those things. And so early in the project, you haven't spent any money. Late in the project, you spend a great deal of money, right? That should be pretty straightforward. If we look at another curve, and this curve is how committed are we to the decisions that we make? That is, how much of the life cycle costs are we locking in at that stage in the process? So early in the process, we make some decisions that say, okay, if I'm making this, this widget, if I make it out of 3 pieces of plastic or make it out of 5 pieces of plastic, that's really different because, a piece of plastic costs 15 cents. If I have 10 of them in here or I have 3 of them in here, the price difference is really different. It's really big. Or if I decide to do it with a product or with a service, or if I decide to own my own servers or not my own servers. So get the idea. You're going to lock in decisions, and you have to do it early because later decisions require you to have locked in earlier decisions. So it looks something like this, right? So we start down, we very quickly lock in. So, okay. And this precedes our expenditures. So we make the decisions before we actually spend the money to do the thing. Now if we look at the ability that we have to change, the ability that we have to improve performance or make it faster, make it better, make it cheaper, any of those things, it has this other property where at the very early we can make really big decisions, really big, interesting changes to a project because we haven't bought a lot of stuff, we haven't trained a lot of people, we haven't printed all the brochures. And late in the project, wow, it's really hard to do anything. And the changes are really difficult and they're very, very expensive. And so, for example, I was working on a project once for a big computer company. They say, hey, we'd like you to get some cost out of this product. We have this laptop and it costs too much. Can you get some $10 of cost out of the product? And I'm thinking, well, okay. And I look inside and say, well, if I paint this instead of putting a sticker here, I could save 1/8 of a cent. $5, even $10 at 1/8 of a cent at a time is a really hard place to get to. Okay, so late in the project is really difficult and early in the project is really easy. I said, if you had brought me this laptop, before you started the project, we could have taken $100 of cost out, not even worried about $10 of cost. So again, here you have the actual expenditures, you see the commitment to life cycle costs, and then you see our ability to change. So looking at this thing, you ask the question this. If you went around in your organization and looked at groups' behaviors, when are people in the latte phase? The latte phase is when people are, oh, what a fine latte. We're going to have a meeting. Let's meet over at Starbucks. Well, Joe can't make it. That's okay. We can meet in 2 weeks. And people are just really taking it easy. That's generally at the beginning of a project, right? And at the end of the project is what I call the hair on fire stage. Oh my God, my hair's on fire. We're going to die. And everyone's running around and people are worried about they're going to get fired and this thing has to ship and they're not going home. They're just like working like dogs. Okay. That's at the end of projects, right? In this later stage of the project. So why would it be that we work like crazy, like dogs, at the end when we spent the money, where we're committed, where we have very little power to change? And at the beginning of the project, what a fine latte, isn't that? Oh, Joe can't make it. We're wasting time. We're not doing the stuff that needs to get done, that has the power. We haven't spent the money, we have a huge amount of power to change, and we haven't committed to a way. Why do we do that? Why do groups do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One reason might be that your latte phase of one project actually coincides with the hair on fire phase of the previous project. And so you're so busy with the previous project, you don't have the time to put into the new project. And so you're robbing time from this project to pay the other project. That could be really problematic. Another thing I think that happens is, so I'll overlay my idea of process on top of this thing, is we don't know what to do in that early stage. So in this early stage in the process, without really having a good sense of what the behaviors are required when, we just sort of sit around and we don't act. We're not sure what to do. We don't know what behaviors would help us move down this curve, would help us move along here. And so this is where I overlay this process and say, okay, you really need to be working hard on this. And in fact, what you could do is we know at the end of projects, people fear for their lives. They fear for getting fired if they don't get the project done, but they don't feel that same feeling up front. Maybe up front you could say, look, you need to have 100 ideas, and if you don't have 100 ideas by tomorrow, you're fired. And that would allow people to get the kind of the urgency early in the project that you need to be able to take advantage of the great amount of cost savings, the great amount of change that you can make, the performance improvement, and the life cycle cost reduction that happens in that early stage. So these process constraints, that was about managing the early stages. Now let's talk for a moment about choosing participants carefully. And so a moment ago I showed you these types of innovators, the radical innovators with the type R, and the adaptive innovators, the type A. And so they have these properties, and think about which one you are for a moment. So if you think about this and say, okay, when would I use which type of innovator? When would I want them to participate where in this process? Right? Because R's have a certain strength that they do, and A's have a certain strength that they do. They have these other properties. Like, when would you use them? Well, we normally don't think this way. We normally think, okay, I need someone from sales and someone from marketing and someone from engineering. Don't do it that way. The better way to do it is to say, I need some R's and some A's. This is a super radical project, and I need some super radical people here. Or maybe it's not a radical project, and Mr. Anti-Gravity, I don't need you right now, and so why don't you go do something else while we have this project going. Then once I have them in the project team, I got to think about where I want them. Maybe I want a lot of R action here because R's are radical. They're going to think lots of different ways. They are divergent. But then I need to bring it back together and use my A's there, or put an A in charge there. I have my R's and I have my A's. And then I have places of transition where I may need people to use some R energy and bring the A over, right? So that the radicals are going out and I need to bring it down to A, and again and again and again. So if we think about radical behavior, adaptive behavior, or seeking radical change or seeking adaptive change, and not just, we do it consciously and not just a tendency, not just because we don't know any other way to behave, but we do it because this is the right way to do it, I think it's a super powerful way to look at what happens in your groups and moving the groups forward. So again, get your R's and stock your R's, and if you're an R, you know how to do A, and if you're an A, you also know how to do R. And so just remind people, right now we're divergent. We're doing the divergent behavior. Next we're going to do the adaptive behavior, the convergent behavior, but not now. That's going to be tomorrow. It'll be a different time. And so when we choose participants carefully, we can actually help them behave properly, because we're going to put them in a process. We're going to say, this is the time to do, and this is the thing to do now. And if people are willing to behave appropriately, the R's are willing to do R behaviors when R is required, then you should have them in a team. And if they're not, then don't invite them. Have the meeting when they're not there. Or at least talk to them about, this is the way the process works. This time we're generating ideas, here we're selecting ideas, here we're doing this, here we're doing that. And the behavior you're exhibiting is way out here, but that's not where we are. We're at this stage in the process. So please help. Behave appropriately.